Welcome to the third edition of the Environmental Humanities Book Chat, in which we will be discussing Adrian Ivakhiv's Ecologies of the Moving Image, Cinema, Affect, Nature. And here is my own copy of it, heavily marked, which came out in the Wilfrid Laurier University UP's Environmental Humanities series in 2013. Our guests today hail from what are probably the two major research centers in the environmental humanities in Europe, from the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich and the Environmental Humanities Lab at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. Let me first introduce Anna Åberg. She defended, did I pronounce that right? Åberg?
Åberg, really, but
okay, never mind.
Never mind.
She defended her PhD in 2013 at the Royal Institute Division, at the Royal Institute's Division for the History of Science, Technology, and Environment, and her thesis, A Gap in the Grid, explores the role of natural gas in late 20th century Sweden. And she has recently received the Fernand Braudel post-doctoral fellowship, which will allow her to develop a project on fusion research in France and the Soviet Union. And she'll explore the narrative and imaginative strategies used by different actors to promote, criticize, and interpret technological developments. And Anna organized a combined film festival and conference titled Tales from Planet Earth in Stockholm in April 2014. So she has recently dealt a lot with environmental film, I suppose. And this was a cooperation between the Royal Institute, the Royal Institute's Environmental Humanities Lab, and the Center for Culture, History, and the Environment at the University of Wisconsin. And this was a festival that brought together researchers, filmmakers, and activists. Our second guest is Seth Peabody, who spent the past year as a research fellow at the Rachel Carson Center and has just recently returned to the Germanic Language Program of Harvard University's Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures, where he is working on a PhD that deals with Weimar-era German films, mountain films, and city films. He told me. And he's been affiliated with the Berkeley, Tübingen, Wien, Harvard Research Network on Modernity in German Culture since 2009. He was also a chair of the Germanic Circle Research Colloquium at Harvard from 2012 to 2013. And his research focuses, as I mentioned, on German cinema, particularly during the Weimar period. So welcome, Anna and Seth, and thanks for being here today. Now, one reason why we chose Adrian Ivakhiv's Ecologies of the Moving Image as the topic for this book chat is that it can be seen as representative of a field that is still relatively new, but has gained a lot of momentum over the past couple of years, namely green film studies or eco-cinema studies, or however one wants to call it. And to name only a handful of the most important titles that came out recently, there was the volume Eco-Cinema Theory and Practice that was edited by Sean Kubit, Salman Bonani, and Stephen Russ that came out in 2012, and Alexa Weik von Mosner's Moving Environments, also Wilfrid Laurier Press just came out. Anil Nareen wrote a book on eco-trauma cinema that will be coming out this fall. So there's been a lot of new scholarship coming out in this area. And it represents a turn away from the focus on literature that has characterized eco-critical scholarship during its first 1 or 2 decades. And I think it's a very welcome turn because if we're interested in the media which actually shape or reflect public attitudes on the environment, it seems rather obvious that film plays a much more important role here than literary texts do these days. So I should say that film studies is not my primary area of expertise, but my sense when reading this book was certainly that Ivakhiv's book was tremendously ambitious. It really tries to provide a comprehensive theoretical framework for an ecological analysis of the moving image. And that's, I think, an important term because he wants this to be not only about film. And he draws on a very wide range of thinkers, most importantly probably Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Peirce, as well as Deleuze and Guattari. And it seeks to deal with all the various aspects that might be relevant in this regard, from the material production of films to their aesthetic structure and their reception by particular audiences. So I expect that we will not be able to cover all of these aspects, but we have to start somewhere. So maybe I can open this discussion by asking you where you see Ivakhiv's book in relation to the larger field of ecocritical film analysis as it stands today, and maybe to what extent it reflects assumptions or theoretical preferences that are perhaps widely shared in the field, and where it maybe stands more alone, or where it diverges from this general trend. I think that would be a question that maybe I first addressed to Seth.
All right. Thanks, Hannes. And thank you for organizing this and inviting me to participate. In terms of Ivakhiv's book within environmental film studies, I agree with you that it's very ambitious. And I would suggest that it's not only showing a turn away from literature within environmental criticism, but also to some extent turn away from or push to at least not be limited to environmental history and materiality as the focus of environmental criticism, but instead very much on how film, in this case, participates and creates its own worlds, as Ivakhiv says. And so his theoretical basis is very much interested in starting with the film and looking at what sorts of worlds are imagined, are created within the medium of film, how forces within films then interact with each other. Human forces, human, earth, and animal, and people are sort of the three elements, the three morphisms he talks about. And starting from there, he then moves out into the world, looking at what resonances emerge within the film and then how they become a force in the physical world, the non-filmic world, after the film. A good example of that is his discussion of Tarkovsky's film Stalker, which then became a reference point in discussions in video games, even dealing with the Soviet past. I found all of this very interesting to read, compelling, theoretically well-grounded. Where it becomes frustrating, and I think we'll talk about this later on, is in the question of to what extent is film limited by its identity as a consumer product or as something that is created out of a certain situation within the world and not just something that has an impact after its creation. Yeah, we can get to that later. I think that's the byproduct of the very thing he's focusing on, which is trying to get really deep inside of the world created by film. And in that, you mentioned Charles Sanders Peirce and Whitehead as the philosophers from which he draws his sort of process relational way of looking at film, and definitely the series of triads that he builds the book around, be it the social and material and perceptual ecologies of film, or the anthropomorphic and biomorphic and geomorphic ways that film creates worlds. Everything comes in threes. That's very much from Peirce. But there's, to me, an almost stronger resonance simply in the way he writes the book with the film writings of Siegfried Kracauer, who I would say has a similar ambition to look at film as a product, in his case, a sort of sociological product, but not by looking at the world from which film emerges as much as by looking closely at the film itself and then arriving at a utopian idea of what film can do. So with Krakauer, it's films from Berlin that are showing the working masses, and Cult of Distraction is one of his classic essays where he talks about the film world just sort of being what the workers need in their sort of meaningless lives, seeking distraction after they get out of work. And he comes to this utopian moment at the end where film could, if it sort of took this distraction to its logical limit, could show the workers this situation that they're in. And I think Ivakhiv is doing the same thing. He's saying film is creating all of these perceptual nuances, and there is a utopian potential in that, where if film carries out some of these really open-ended techniques that he enjoys, he talks about materiality, but it's a materiality within the film, and kind of focusing on like rusty and sticky and unpleasing sorts of material worlds within the film, and he focuses on the quiet rather than the catastrophic, looking at his discussion of Lars von Trier's Melancholia. It's always kind of rethinking these typical issues of environmental themes in film to come to a point where film might lead to a new way of thinking that is somehow more ecologically sound and productive. So that is, to my thinking, the sort of utopian project of the book. And I think it's carried out generally very well, sometimes with mixed success in the individual readings. But as a whole, I think that motivation is what makes the book, in fact, really satisfying as a whole to read.
Is it, I mean, it's, as you mentioned, it's no coincidence then that he picks Tarkovsky to provide the title image of the book, and that the film Stalker plays such an important role for sort of for outlining his project. But which I think that makes something that probably makes him representative for a tendency within eco-film studies, really, right? But really, my question would be to Anna. I mean, since you're an environmental historian primarily, did you? I mean, Seth said that he found this project compelling, but from the perspective of an environmental historian, how did this look to you?
Well, I agree to a large extent with Seth, actually, and I do think it's a very compelling project. I mean, I'm an environmental historian and someone who's worked a lot with film in my sort of work with history, and I do think that what he does in this book that I appreciate is sort of he builds up a sort of a system of film, not only environmental film, but when he talks about these triads, he says that he wants to get away from dualisms as well. And I think that what he helps us with is to get away from those dualisms also when we talk about what is an environmental film as opposed to a film, and what is sort of the real world as opposed to a film world. And he sort of looks at it as a larger ecology, a film ecology, that comes into our world, and which we interact with all the time, that shapes us, which we shape in turn, sort of. And this is a very ambitious and big project, and I do agree that I think he mostly succeeds. I find his analysis compelling for the most part. Then, as an environmental historian, of course, I come from. I mean, Seth pointed out that it's sort of a turn away from a certain material focus within eco-criticism and etc. I come from the side where I think that there's still not enough material focus in eco-criticism and film eco-criticism as well, and I lack that a bit here as well. But we can get back to that a bit later, I think. What I want to say about what I like as a historian as well is his methodology actually. I have to admit I was a bit confused in the beginning, and then I went to the end of the book, and there is a nice figure there that I think helps many people. It helped me a lot, and because when he starts talking about his different triads that Seth was talking about, first I had a bit of a problem figuring out what they were supposed to be for or how they were supposed to interact. But when you look at the figure in the end, you see that they become more of a layered system, sort of a system of interpretation, so to speak. And I think that in order to be able to interpret such a system as this, the film sort of ecology, you need to have all of these layers on top of each other. And it's just not triads, it becomes like 6, 9, a grid. And that's what I think that the methodology can do and can help us with. And when you look at the methodology in the end as well, and the questions that are asked there, I think that can be a very good help for anyone who wants to do an interesting analysis of film as a way of forming and as a frame of how we relate to our environment and how we are a part of the environment.
Seth, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I really agree with what you say about the grid that emerges. In my notes I keep calling it a matrix or something like that. That he's fighting dualisms, and the response to that is triads, which in fact just adds another piece. You're still limited to 3 if you really limit yourself to a triad, but he's never doing that. It's always sort of a series of triads working against each other. And from that's sort of a launching point. Like in reading his most compelling specific analyses, I'm not sure I would ever be able to draw a triad based on what he's doing. To me, the framework is more a point of liberation from what he sees as very limiting frameworks that came before. And that allows him to do some really nuanced work with cinema. And I did something very similar in reading the book. I sort of worked backwards at the beginning because structurally, for all of its kind of thick theoretical work, the film has some really strong structuring points that make it very sound in terms of its readability as an academic volume. And one of them is the appendix, which gives a nice graphic model, which I can show, of the system he draws up. And I think he then first shows it in graphic form and then outline form. And if you're looking through that, it sort of, I think, frees you from being stuck trying to follow the prose of the system. The other thing is, yeah, and in his final chapters, he also sort of recapitulates very well the argument to this point. He says that exact phrase, I think, and then sort of lays that out over 2 pages, and then proceeds with his next point. So while it seems, if you just look at the appendix, like it's sort of a grid, and this is how we will analyze cinema, I think the actual impact of the book is more this cumulative effect of allowing, sort of gradually building up layers, and then with always the previous layers in mind, being able to add something new. And I think all sort of environmental aspects aside, that allows him to just do good film analysis.
Sorry, we lost the connection there for a second. Yeah, but if I can ask back there, because that was one of the points in the book where I sometimes found that these connections that the connection between these different layers or these different parts of the triad wasn't always as compelling, or wasn't. Well, I didn't always find that terribly convincing. I mean, I find the individual parts. He says, okay, we need to look at the film as a spectacle, as narrative, as sign. That's one of the triads he makes. Or we need to look at the way in which an audience. I mean, for example, he does with several films. He has long discussions of audience responses to the films, which I thought was really helpful and very interesting. But I didn't see how what he said about the audience response, for example, sort of grew out of these other layers. I mean, he keeps saying that the layers sort of they're always emergent. It's never only one. It's always one emerging out of the other. But these are theoretical claims that in his analyses, I think that I didn't always find these analyses to support the theoretical claims that he makes. And I generally sometimes had the impression that it's a very ambitious and encompassing theoretical framework, and a lot of the analyses really it's kind of in excess of what he actually does in the analyses. I don't know, or am I being unfair here?
I don't think you're being unfair. I think you're bringing out one of the major difficulties of the project he's trying to do, which is I think it's difficult for any book to very compellingly do both a theory and use that theory as a method, because I think those are generally very different things. Right. I'm thinking of a specific example. We could just start at the beginning again with Stocker. He has a very, I think, fascinating discussion of Tarkovsky's film. And he starts with that and talks about the zone that the Stocker sort of leads the two other characters into, and the zone as a possible metaphor for cinema, but possibly also many other things. And then I think some of his most intriguing points have to do with just there's a dream sequence where he talks about this kind of sort of odd, really dusty, dirty, rusty materiality within the film. That's and saying that people see this as a metaphor, but maybe it's just the physical world and its decay and all of these things. And as a discussion of what film can do, I find that great. And then that ends, and he discusses the resonance of the film after the fact and the way it became this sort of, it was seen outside of Russia as this resistance piece. It was used, sort of referred to within Russia in lots of different ways, which is also fascinating, but I don't think that requires the interpretation he'd already done of the film. And I guess
he does talk about the material aspects that Anna was sort of asking for, right? He does talk about the fact that in the location where it was filmed, that it was polluted, and some of the people from the crew got sick, and Tarkovsky died of cancer, and it does bring that in, but I'm not sure whether I see how they grow out of each other. But yeah.
I agree, and I don't think there needs to necessarily... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. I think I think it's simply a type of discrepancy problem which comes from that. I mean, most of the theoretical framework he uses is about perception and narrative, and it comes from film studies, or from other type of philosophical backgrounds where you look at how we perceive the world and how we form the world, etc. And if you want to do the whole system, in my opinion, you need to also, and that's also what I think he wants. If you look at the questions in the methodology, for example, it's all there. You want to look at not only what happened to the workers at the place, but at money, at the organization, at labor overall. Things, and it's all there in the methodology, but it's not there in the theoretical framework, I think, that he's using, because there are very few of those kinds of frameworks within this field that actually deal with these things. And the same thing, I think, with reception, although I think that's more dealt with in a sense. So I think he puts it there as empirical facts, and he tries to bring it in. But I think there's a difficulty in connecting that to the theoretical part, just because the theory comes from somewhere else. Sort of, we would need a theory that goes over the whole spectrum as well.
It's also, I agree. I think it's also, I think, not just the theory that makes it difficult. It's also the examples he focuses on. The films he celebrates the most are things like Tarkovsky. They're more open-ended. They are ambivalent, and to come up with sort of a monolithic interpretation that points directly towards some sort of aftermath would be reductive, and he's very aware of that. He talks about March of the Penguins and Happy Feet later on, and I think there he show more of a direct line between his interpretation of the film and then the way the film was received in different communities and the way it might have impacted or played a role in, for example, March of the Penguin, actually both of them within discussions of global warming within the Christian sort of online discussion community. And there I find it's more coherent but much less interesting, simply because I'm not sure that the films he's discussing there are worth as much really close attention as the, at least in terms of interpreting the film. Yeah, certainly as a product that circulates within discussions of global warming, yes, there's something there. But the attention he gives to the film with Tarkovsky is very much justified, but I think really difficult to connect clearly to what comes after the film.
Actually, I think I have a different. I think that what I like with the book is that he brings up those films and gives them attention, because those are the films that people watch. And if this is a book that where we think about how we how we form nature and how nature is formed by us, I think these films become extremely important. More important actually than Stockholm. That's my personal opinion. but the thing is that I don't. That's also where the problem is. I mean, you can look at the reception of that, and he does, and I think he does it well. I like his analysis of Grizzly Man. I also like his analysis of Avatar. But the thing is that I would also like an analysis of Avatar that takes into account that it cost $240 million to do it, or probably $500 million actually. And what happens with those amounts of money, and they go into creating effect, right? They go into creating landscape. They go into creating all of our relationships with the environment. And I think we need to talk about that as well. Maybe it is done. It's just not, I just haven't read it. But I do think that, yeah.
Yeah. He does talk about the impact of tourism on a set of different places. He talks about Lord of the Rings as sort of the best that any of the examples he looked at has done, where it became a whole tourist economy, but it at least impacted the local economy in a positive way, compared to various other films where some island becomes the scene of a movie and then becomes sort of a colonized tourist site for people to go and see what they saw in the movie, which is not it's not pushing the local economy to develop in a new direction or something like that. I think that's something I think he deals with pretty well, is the aftermath of a film on a local place, but the fact that it cost hundreds of $millions before, and that there's I fully agree that is sort of something missing here. And I think it's in his structure of the book already. He talks about firstness as the impact of the film, watching it, and secondness from Peirce as the sort of response to the film, and then thirdness is adding meaning and something like that. But the first thing is already the film. There's nothing before that. And so there's a way in which this thirdness, where you bring in your knowledge outside of the film, that actually comes first. There's a way in which the social conditions around the film control what kind of a film can be made in the first place, and what people might go to view the film. And that, yeah, this whole span of time and materiality leading up to the emergence of a film is absent.
Yeah. And I mean, this is not only with him, I think. I mean, it's not. I'm not blaming Ivakhiv specifically for this. In my opinion, this is something that's sort of problematic all over when we speak about film and film and environment and these kinds of things. But and I guess it also has to do with the expectancy that I was hoping that he would bring in more of that. So.
Right. No, I agree. One of the, from a cultural studies perspective, one of the good questions for film is what questions within society does this film provide an answer to? What caused this film to be made at this time, and what caused people to want to see this film? And it is, again, as part of his project, is to flip the question around and say, what questions does this film cause? What results from this film as a product in itself? But right, I think just sort of, if you want to be so expansive as he clearly does, then there's something that needs to come first.
Especially, I think, which I think was interesting, you spoke in the beginning about that he has a sort of utopian idea here about, he even speaks a little bit about what's a good film and what's a good spectator, sort of, even though, of course, I mean, it becomes slightly normative, even though he doesn't, I don't think that's what he means with it. And he, of course, has, like, if we talk about a good thing, it's because of these criteria, etc. Like, I'm not saying that he thinks that there is something called good film or bad film in that sense, but he still discusses, like, what kind of film makes us act, what kind of film makes us react, what kind of film makes us reevaluate our relationship to our environment and to nature. And when you want to get into those kinds of issues, I think that's very important and a very interesting discussion. And that's also where I think it's good that he brings up both sort of Hollywood blockbusters and more art films or films from different parts of the globe, because they have different impacts and make people act in different ways. And it's interesting to see what they can do for our understanding of nature, and if they can do something for us to act, and when they do make us act.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a tension, right? That's that question and the question of materiality, whether there's too much or too little in eco-criticism. I think those are sort of a central tension to eco-criticism, in that you're looking at a cultural text and wanting to take it seriously, and he says, like, film produces worlds. The world is made up of signs. The world is meaning making all the way down. There's no original world from which signs emerge. He's clear about that throughout, that his idea of the world that he's studying is one that is made up of signs, and film is a big part of that. Right. But there's still, yeah, and part of it is me as a reader. I want to say he says that, but there's something else that's missing.
Yeah, I mean, if maybe to add to that, I have to say, I think one of the things that makes the book tremendously, that makes it really enjoyable, I think, is the very wide scope of it. I mean, it covers so many different kinds of films. It has an almost encyclopedic character, and I think one of them, certainly readers will appreciate the fact that there's an index at the end. And I mean, I came away from the book with sort of at least a dozen, with a list of at least a dozen films where I said, okay, I have to watch this. And I think that's, if a book does that, that is already a great service to the field to present a survey of this kind.
Certainly, right. And I also think that the book moves in its sort of narrative, beginning to end, in that it celebrates sort of openness throughout, and it particularly in that type of film, these sort of more open-ended films that playfully gesture at new ideas of how we might imagine the world, something like that. There's a great number of films that I really must see after reading this book. And then he gets to his final two chapters, and that's the last real chapter is where he starts talking about what we sort of expect about the trauma of environmentalism, of the environmental crisis now, and I found that a very intriguing sort of new take on the genre, where he sort of looks at crisis films like The Day After Tomorrow and works through them somewhat quickly, and that's been done before. But then what he moves to after that is films that sort of quietly accept crisis and sort of use that as a point of creativity, something like Melancholia, where you have the end of the world represented by a giant blue planet quietly floating into the earth and destroying it. And there is no gigantic explosion and ball of fire. That's just sort of the starting point from which he builds his narrative. And I feel like that, I'm not to say that film is the answer to environmental cinema that can change the world, but But that idea of like looking for something other than crisis narratives, he mentions that focus on catastrophe is not productive. It leads people to isolate themselves or to shut down. This is also a big topic in sort of environmental discussions these days, how to do away with the gloom and doom narrative that dominates. And he offers, I think, some really intriguing answers to that in his final real chapter. And then comes the afterword, which is very brief, something like 10 pages, dealing with digital film and the fact that everything he's been discussing is cinema as this structure put together by an industry. But now you have digital video, which is completely open-ended. It's many users, many receivers, and it's a neat final gesture, just saying like this is actually a way possibly of carrying out the open-endedness that he's been sort of searching through in specific art films, but in sort of the digital world, it's a very broad scale on which that happens. So, yeah.
I think this also connects very well to sort of the problems we're thinking about within environmental humanities now. There's about well, what Rob Nixon has called slow violence, in that we can't really see the environmental changes that much, and there are very few disasters happening. Well, to some people they are happening, but to many people in the world it's just very slow changes. And how can we understand these changes and perhaps do something about them or adapt or live with them? And that this sort of mirrors in his analysis of the films, I think, that's if we want to understand this way of seeing the world and this way of how the world is changing, then we also need to look at the films who have already almost anticipated this, or look that already are expressing this sort of thing. I also enjoyed the afterword a lot, and I think I think we need to. I don't think it's the end of cinema really, but I think it's going to be an interesting future field of research, and which is already going on.
Right.
Where we can get a lot of things.
In any case, since we're talking about the afterword already, this may be a good place to close our discussion, because we've already overshot the half an hour that we have allotted to ourselves. So I don't know. Do either of you want to say a few things by way of closing, or?
Maybe rather than try to sum everything up, I'd think about what have we missed. There's a long chapter on sort of ethnographic film, very broadly interpreted, and to my mind, essentially what that does is take sort of what we know from gaze theory and a lot of feminist theory about who has the power to look and who is looked at, and applies that to a sort of post-colonial world, which also isn't brand new, but then thinks of that as a way of reclaiming, or of possibly colonized groups reclaiming visual territory that was taken from them on film, and also searching for ways to see a world on film without claiming it. And I found that at times troubling also, because there's a way in which it equates sort of non-Western ethnic groups with landscape. If we're talking about environmental film, why does this chapter really belong? But at the same time, Rob Nixon is what made me think of that. We know very well that sort of environmental destruction worldwide and colonialism are very much linked. And I found that chapter as a whole very, very thorough and very convincing in the way it looks at the way film has done that and has also resisted it. So yeah, which is just to add another layer to the many layers we've sort of talked about.
Yeah, I think that's
the book carries it well.
I mean, the book is 400. Well, depends on the edition, but it's a big tome, really. So there's a lot of aspects of the book that we've probably not been able to deal with in this talk, and maybe, yeah, but I don't think we can remedy this at this point. And we should probably call it a day. So thank you very much, Anna and Seth, for this discussion, and to our viewers, again, this is the book, Ecologies of the Moving Image, Adrian Ivakhiv, and thank you very much, and have a good day.